James Baldwin once wrote, "I am what time, circumstance, and history have made of me, certainly, but I am also much more than that." And that's really why I wanted to start Black on Black. My name is Julian Michael. I'm a comedian, I'm a writer, I'm an educator. I do a lot of things, but really, Black on Black isn't about me. It's about sharing stories of all kinds of people from across the diaspora, and I hope that when you listen, you'll learn something, you'll enjoy, and you'll start a conversation. Check out Black on Black right here on Dragon Wagon Radio.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quillers. We're so glad to have you on another exciting episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. Today in the studio, we have as our special guest, Tom Woosnam. He is a retired high school physics teacher and has been an actor throughout most of his life, starting with his high school experiences. Shakespeare has been a very big part of that experience, and he's also a graduate of the program at RADA in England. Tom himself is from merry old England, and as you'll hear from his wonderful accent as we invite him to the program, one of the things we're going to talk to him about is how he became an Oxfordian, how his physics background as a scientist has informed his decisions with regards to the Shakespeare authorship question, and some of his acting experience as well, and the Shakespearean productions he has been a part of. Tom, welcome. Good to have you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So tell me, what I'd like to start with is, how did you become a high school physics teacher? What prompted that in your life?
Well, that's a great question. I wasn't expecting that one. In high school, I came first in history one year and first in physics in the exams. And I was leaning towards history, and my father said, "Do you know how many unemployed historians there are?" And I think that one chance comment said, "Okay, that's probably a good idea."
Sure.
And I chose physics. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. There probably are, unless you're a very good novelist or book writer, I would assume that there are a lot of historians out there who are looking for work.
Exactly.
So you decided to go the route of physics, but that's interesting for me to hear. Okay, so obviously, your love for history plays a big part of your intrigue and interest in the Shakespeare authorship question as well. So you've got kind of this double thing, this love for history and this scientific mind when it comes to inquiry into this type of thing. So tell me a little bit about how you fell into the authorship question.
Yeah. Julia and I and Carol Sue were talking about this earlier driving up here and trying to get the dates right. So it was in the 80s when I started courting, if you will, Julia, and I was living in the Bay Area. We had a mutual friend. Julia was working for the Oregon Shakespeare Festival.
And Julia is your wife.
Is my wife, That's right. And so because she had a daytime job, I had lots of time in the day when I was staying up here, being a teacher, long summer vacations. And I wandered into the library, and this would be, and we were trying to recreate the date. It would have been 1988, we're pretty sure. And in the Shakespeare section of the library were pamphlets from what was then the Shakespeare Oxford Society, I believe. I don't remember. And I started browsing and thought, this is interesting. I wasn't aware of this issue at all. Then I got Charlton Ogburn's book, The Mysterious William Shakespeare, which had come out in 1984, if I'm correct. And started reading it, was absolutely captivated. Mentioned it to Julia, who at the time was a pretty strict Stratfordian, I think, or possibly hadn't thought much about it. And she found that she was being persuaded by what I was saying. There was a program, still is, a lecture series, sponsored by OSFA, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival Association. And the man, I think in charge, or at least very instrumental, was called Ed Brubaker, a friend of Julia's. And Julia mentioned to Ed, Tom's interested in the Shakespeare authorship question. And Ed said, great, we'll get him on the docket then. So I am pretty sure it was the following year, 1989, that I was one of the guest lecturers as part of the series. And I had spent the previous summer and that summer too putting together basically a case for Oxford at that particular time.
So at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, they allowed you to come and speak heresy. I can't imagine how that happened. We've been trying to break that puzzle for a while. Like we've been trying to crack that nut for a while. So tell me, like, how did that happen?
I think really because of the friendship between Ed and Julia, and he was open-minded about the whole thing. And you're absolutely right. Now it just seems outrageous that they would do that. And certainly there were many rumblings apparently behind the scenes about who is this idiot and why are we allowing this? But because it was sponsored by Oxford, there was good advertising for it. My name and face were on the board out there for a week before, and the place was packed. Clearly there was a lot of interest in the topic. Lots of questions back and forth. And it was a very good schooling for me in trying to break a barrier, which is very, very hard to break when people are so wedded to a belief, which becomes a part of them. Though I must say, in the main, the audience was quite respectful. So that would have been 1989. Now, there was an actor at the festival called Jamie Newcomb, who was an Oxfordian, and he wanted to have a debate with Barry Kraft, who was the dramaturg at the time. And he did that. And I went to that, and I cannot remember the date of it.
Now, is Jamie still a member of the company there at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, or he has moved on?
I think he's moved on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I went along.
Or was he pushed out because of his heretical views as an Oxfordian?
A conspiracy theory. I smell one right there. So I went to that, and I think Jamie also found how difficult it is in a 1 hour period to really get a grasp of one side and convince the other side. And I stood up at the end and asked a question and happened to mention to Barry, have you read The Mysterious William Shakespeare by Charlton Ogburn? And he said, no, I haven't read it. Okay, fine. And it turned out there was a member of the audience who knew Charlton Ogburn and mentioned it to him. And lo and behold, and I'm looking through my file right now, dated 11th of August, 1993. May I read this?
Sure, go ahead.
Dear Mr. Woosnam, Elizabeth Caldwell gave me the note you took the trouble and had the great kindness to write at Ashland, and perhaps you can imagine with what gratification, exhilaration, and gratitude I read it. How wonderful that you could pay such a tribute to the mysterious William Shakespeare, and that you were able to give 2 lectures on the authorship question at the festival. Now, that's interesting because I think that was a misunderstanding. It was just one lecture and then a debate. To continue, Elizabeth told me that you had spoken up to great effect after the debate, taking occasion to compliment my book, and from what I was able to make out from the tape of the proceedings she brought back, I can realize how fortunate I and others of like mind were in your performance. I'm glad to know that you get the Shakespeare Oxford Society newsletter, and I hope you will indeed be able to make it to South Carolina and look forward to seeing you. I know you're going to make a mark in the controversy. Sincerely yours, Charlton Ogburn. And I treasure this.
What a treasured, yes, absolutely. What a treasured piece of communication from an icon of the movement. And that must be something that you are very proud of to have and own. And I'm glad that you brought it with you today. And wow, he fit a lot into one little 3x5 card here that he mailed to you in very small type print here. So that's fantastic. But he did sign it with his own hand, and that's fabulous too.
Exactly. So anyway, to fast forward here then, so I gave my lecture. I listened to Jamie and Barry with their debate. And then I spoke with Barry. We had a mutual friend, and he agreed to debate me at Carpenter Hall. And
I know it well.
you too, I know. I tried to make it clear that what I was going to do, because this is what I've learned over the years, Stephen, you must have learned this as well. You first of all have to crack the nut of there being an issue to begin with before you jump in with Oxford. You cannot, I found, jump straight in with Oxford. You've got to sow the seeds. So essentially then I talked to Barry by mail mainly about the fact that I wasn't going to directly bring up Oxford's name, but I was saying there is an authorship question. And we exchanged letters a bit. Barry was interested in finding out what my sources were, and he offered to run them off for me. And I think that was his way of saying, I wonder if I can find out what the counter argument is. I'm reading between the lines.
Sure. But anybody who's ever engaged in any kind of debate, or even if it was, on the high school debate team or whatever, the rule is know your adversary, right? You need to know what the counter argument is going to be in order to prepare your own argument the best way, right?
And I've always thought that in any issue, it really gets interesting when you come to the counter arguments to the counter arguments. That's when it really starts to be fun. And I would like to say at this point that I have the highest respect for Barry Kraft. That man has forgotten more Shakespeare than I will ever know. I would never even dream of trying to talk with him in detail about Shakespeare texts. But I agreed with him that I would go first. And I said I'd like there to be time for questions at the end. And so I had 20 minutes. And he had 20 minutes, and then the bulk of the time was taken up with questions. And I think Barry was not quite prepared for the direction I was going in. He had all his guns loaded for it couldn't be Oxford. But on the spot, being a super guy, he's really good. He came up with some counter arguments, and then I countered those. And I think what I treasure the most about that debate with him was afterwards, he came up to me and said, Tom, that was good. Well done. I really enjoyed doing that. I happened to run into him about 3 or 4 weeks ago, very briefly. Hadn't seen him, I think, since. And I said, Barry, Tom Woosnam, remember me? And he says, yes, right, Tom, the heretic.
See, there it is.
Right there. And I so wish that at that time, Diana Price's book had come out and Brian Wildenthal's book had come out. I don't know if you want to tell the audience about those right now.
I think our regular listeners are very familiar with the library. In fact, one of our most recent episodes before this one was about my opinion of what the essential Oxfordian library needs to be. And I could see where, not only those two books that you referenced, but several others that have come out long since the 90s that have really solidified what I believe to be the finer points of the argument for Oxford to be the true author. And I think also it'd be interesting to discuss with Barry how he feels about this evolving idea that there was sort of a cabal of writers responsible for these works, and that there had to be some sort of editor-in-chief who oversaw those writers. And I think that that's one of the strongest arguments for Oxford that's coming through lately, that is helping some Stratfordians sort of let go of that mythology and accept that there's a more rational, more practical answer here that does involve the hands of many of the best minds and writers of the day that we can, without a doubt, trace to either Oxford's employment or his assistance on some of their works, or him writing the foreword to their books, or their books being dedicated to him. I think that is going to be an area where we need to continue to push and do more research and look into, because I think that that's going to be the linchpin ultimately in the end.
I think you're probably right. And I think what you're saying is that there are orthodox Stratfordians, Shakespeare scholars, who are looking in that direction.
Yes.
So with opening the door there, if we do the same thing, perhaps there can be some meeting of the minds. But I still get back to, I do wish that the Stratfordians would actually read the scholarship.
That's the problem too, isn't it?
Isn't it frustrating? I absolutely buy how it can be a threat to someone when one's belief system is challenged. There are all sorts of belief systems I have, and if I'm challenged, my hackles will go up. I get that entirely. And in this issue here, I don't think, though, I was ever really a believer. I had nothing at stake particularly. And just to circle back to you, you mentioned my scientific training.
Yes.
And I'm going to state the obvious here. It's been stated before. But this topic does appeal to people whose professions require logic and statements of facts and follow them. Doctors, engineers, lawyers, judges. It's their bread and butter. So it becomes a fascinating thing for them. And to a large degree, emotion can stay out of it. Emotion never really stays out of anything. But nonetheless, that's why I think there are so many people in those professions who are part of our group.
Well, you know, and I've actually had conversations with close friends about this topic where ultimately the conversation has boiled down to me saying to them, and not in a condescending way, but just in pointing out this truth, which is, I know all there is to know about your guy. How much do you know about my guy? And it's really difficult to have a productive conversation with somebody who really doesn't know anything about our guy. And it's ironic that one of the analogies I often use is I always say I would never walk into a discussion with a physicist and try to tell him about physics, because I don't know what I don't know. And I think that sums up a lot of the problem with having these conversations with people who are married to the Stratfordian myth, and that is that they don't know what they don't know. And so I think one of the things that we all can do as researchers and as inquirers into the Shakespeare authorship question, and as well as Oxfordians or Baconians or whatever theory is your flavor of the day, I think the best thing we can do is encourage people to read. You know, please read some stuff. And that's why we are constantly inviting authors of books onto the program. It's why I did an episode recently just about my particular library and the books that I feel that are important. And I think if we could just encourage people to pick up a book on this and read about our guy, I think that is the best door opener.
I agree. Two other quick comments there. I still don't have the elevator pitch, if one can put it that way, to use for somebody who immediately says, oh, you're a flat earther, or you really believe in that stuff. Oh, come on. I'd love to have a sort of, not necessarily a snappy response, but one that focuses the issue. I've thought about that a lot. And then circling back again to physics, I used to show my students a video on dark matter. And I would emphasize one scientist's statement there. And he looks at the camera and he says, well, in the end, it's all about the data, isn't it? And I firmly believe that it really, really is. And then you come back to the interesting thing being the counter-arguments to the counter-arguments. So we made arguments, then there have been counter-arguments. Now, where are the counter-arguments to those? They aren't there. It's so much ad hominem. And that really is sad if you have to resort to ad hominem. I'm talking about many Stratfordians now, not all.
It's true. And that's another aspect of this as well, is that it becomes with many, not all, but with many people who do have this, as you said, this marriage to what they've been taught or what they've been told, or the guy from Stratford, you do find that there is a defensiveness that comes into play, and they do result to ad hominem attacks, and they do verge away from the facts and the truth and the historical aspects of it because they don't have a proper retort. And I think that in itself is something that demonstrates that they're on shaky ground, the pun intended.
Right. Right.
And if we can somehow get them to just learn a little bit about the life of Edward de Vere and take a look at how that lays over some of the details of the texts and the details in the plays, I think that for me has always been the one go-to. And it's difficult. You can't put that in an elevator speech. And so, I've been at this for how long now? I'm not even sure I can put a date on it at this point. I was 19 when the authorship question was first introduced to me. I didn't become an Oxfordian until much later on from that. But I can tell you that for me, the study of it and each new book and each new interview I do as the host of this program and each outreach effort I do as the PR and marketing director for the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, I still don't, with all of that behind me, I still don't have that, quick 30-second, because I don't know that it's possible, quite honestly. I think what you have to do is try to open the door to someone and then see what their response is and have an entire quiver of arrows available to you to go, okay, this is what this bullseye requires. You know what I mean? I use that analogy in theater too with actors. I say, when you, and you'll understand this because you're an actor, but you go into a performance and you've got a certain number of arrows in your quiver, right? And you need to use them wisely throughout your performance. If you just go out there firing arrows left and right, then you're not hitting any marks and the audience is not going to be with you or with your character. So you have to find where exactly to use those arrows, aim wisely, and make sure you hit a bullseye with every single one of them. And I say that dramatic pauses are one of those arrows, for instance. I'll tell actors all the time, stop Shatnerizing on my stage. Right. Use your arrows wisely.
Good line.
Right? You are not Legolas. Right. You have got to be much more precise in your choices. And I think that that's true in engaging with those who are new to this topic or who are steadfast against this topic, is you have to wait and see what armor they're putting on before choosing the weapon that you need to use to try to get through that armor.
Yeah. Couple of random thoughts there. I think that the best that I've come up with, not that I've used it very often, if somebody confronts me on this, would be to say, that's really interesting. Tell me how much you've read about this, and then perhaps we can have a conversation. Generally, they haven't read anything. And then talking about the issue, which we haven't yet, who cares? Who wrote the works? I was listening yesterday to the Beatles channel on Sirius XM, and there was a guest who had put together this very clever selection of songs about marriages, as it turns out. But what was relevant and struck me was he said, I've chosen these songs because there is a story behind. I know the story behind Strawberry Fields. I know the story behind He Said, and so on and so forth. And then he ended with, I guess the point is always tell a story about a song because people love stories. Well, you could just put the word play in instead of song. Tell a story about the play because people love stories. You're going to pull people into Shakespeare, especially high schoolers.
That's actually an excellent analogy, because if you think about how many radio programs there are, and podcasts too, that are, sort of like behind the scenes, behind the record, the origins of the albums type of things, Joe Benson made an entire career out of, and probably a lot of people out there know, I must have to know who Uncle Joe Benson is. And if you don't, look him up. Uncle Joe Benson, he's like, the godfather of rock and roll radio. And he made almost an entire career out of those kinds of stories and inviting artists on as well to his program to explain the story behind a song or behind an album, or interesting stories about the recording session and how it could have gone terrible or how they put it together. Or, those kinds of things are very intriguing to people. And people love to hear that kind of stuff. I like to think that one of the reasons why we have the fans that we do of this podcast is because it's intriguing to people. It gives them that sort of background, that insight, that information, things that they didn't know. I get emails from listeners who comment about specific episodes and why those episodes speak to them. One of the most recent ones was I received an email from a listener who tuned into an episode I did with Dr. Earl Showerman about Shakespeare's medical knowledge. And in the email, the listener wrote, I didn't realize there were more than 700 medical attributions or connections in the works of the play. And now it makes me go through and want to read those plays and look for them more. And I was like, great, that's exactly the point. That's why we're here. That's why this program exists. It's for episodes like that. And so I would wonder, one of the things I would ask you then is, what kind of knowledge of physics did our author have, in your opinion?
Very good question. Can't answer it. I haven't actually read the plays with an eye to that. I should have done.
Okay, well, there you go. There's a project for you, right?
Exactly.
That's it. And you know what? That would be an awesome presentation at a conference too. Shakespeare the physicist. What was his understanding of physics? There have been certain books written, and I believe that some of the dating of the plays can be narrowed down through his changing understanding of the solar system. I think in the works of Shakespeare, you can see the writer go from a geocentric belief system to a heliocentric belief system. And if you look at the time that the plays are being written, that makes sense because that's what the world is doing at that time, right? Bruno and others. So I think that right in there, you can kind of get a sense of the progression of his mind through the plays. I always like to bring up A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Hermia says, well, when Lysander says, I don't love you, I love her. And she says, that can't be. I would sooner believe that there is a hole through the earth so that the sun, I'm paraphrasing the text there, but she basically says, I would sooner believe that there's a hole through the earth so that the sun and the moon can look at each other. Well, that's a geocentric belief system, right? The earth is the center, right? And everything revolves around the earth.
Exactly.
But then, you get into Hamlet, and he's talking about the constellations and the comets, and it's very clear in the texts of Hamlet that at that point he knows that the sun is the center of the solar system and that the universe is boundless, right? I could call myself a king of infinite space in a walnut shell, right? That's a brilliant progression of that mind, right?
Well, you've certainly given me something to think about there.
Awesome.
Something I should follow up
one
on.
of the things I really pride myself about being the host of this series is that with each interview, it's almost inevitably some point in the program, one of these ideas comes between the guest and me, and we go, oh, that'd be a great story, or that'd be a great research paper, or that would be a great presentation to work on. I send out literally thousands of press releases on a regular basis for this organization, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Somewhere around 8,000 media outlets or individual reporters or journalists. And on occasion, I will receive a response from a journalist that is, you're a flat earther, or it's all hogwash, and I almost, in every sense, I always respond with, well, I'm sorry that you as an objective journalist have taken this position against a bona fide 60-year-old nonprofit organization and not treating us like any other organization that you deal with receiving press releases from on a regular basis. But also, let's talk about whatever their argument is, right? So the latest one was the guy who sent me a response regarding the March 4th centennial of John Thomas Looney's book, Shakespeare Identified. And he responded with, you Oxfordian people, you discount genius, right? That's one of the common ones we get, is that we're snobs, that we're aristocrats, we're elitists,
right?
And we discount the power of genius. And he made the terrible mistake of pointing to Albert Einstein as his example of how natural genius can be. And, this poor Jew who had to scramble to make a living and to make it and to get educated. And I just responded back and said, yeah, absolutely. But let's look at the education he did receive. Let's look at the geometry book that he was first given at age 12 that he called, in his own words, sacred, and how he mastered it by age 12. And how at age 16, he had a medical student as a tutor who introduced him further into the laws of physics and science. And then how he ended up going to school in Switzerland and the masterful education he got there and the peers that he had there as well. And the instructors and professors who helped him. So like when you look at, and then let's look at how he was ostracized by that community because he was so damn smart. They hated him for it. And the first jobs that he applied for in learning, he was refused. He kept being constantly rejected because they didn't like him because he was. And so I said to this journalist, I sent back, I said, you have found the perfect example that matches our guy, Edward de Vere. And in fact, the similarities between their lives are astounding. And so thank you so much for pointing that out.
Uh-huh.
And so I hope that you will now do a little bit of study into Oxford's life and see how these parallels between Edward de Vere and Albert Einstein are almost uncanny.
And of course, he replied to you.
Not crickets, not a peep.
That's the frustrating part, isn't it, Stephen?
Yes.
You get so close and then it falls apart.
So I'm decided, I think I'm going to propose for this coming conference this year in Ashland that I want to do a presentation on those parallels, not only the parallels between Einstein and Oxford, but I'm going to throw in a third person, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Those are three magnificent geniuses who became what they became through their genius, but because the genius was fostered in the right environment.
Exactly.
And you cannot separate the two. And so when people go, well, you discount genius. Yeah, you put genius in the middle of the Siberian wilderness and see what comes out of it. Perhaps the best lumberjack in the world. Perhaps the best elk hunter in the world. But if you put genius in the middle of Salzburg with a great musical education, you put genius in the middle of Switzerland with a great education in physics and science, you put genius in the middle of Renaissance England with a great education in literature and poetry and all the other sciences, like that's what you get.
And there's nothing to say that the man from Stratford could not have done that. We simply don't have the evidence.
Exactly right.
And that's the key to the whole thing. Show me some evidence and I'll drop this whole Oxford stuff immediately. I've no horse in that race particularly, just the truth. In the end, it's about the data. Where is that evidence? And that's why Diana Price's book is so invaluable. And Brian, too, in showing that these questions came up way before people said they did. Contemporaneous questions about the authorship. It's
absolutely. So let's switch gears just a little bit here and let's talk a little bit about your history as a thespian. How do you first discover the stage? Tell me, I'm so intrigued by the stories of those who have tread the boards and what their initial experience was when it came to the stage. Tell me about the first play you were ever in.
Oh my goodness. That would be, I suppose, in elementary school. It was just a small little skit more than anything. And I remember it mainly because I had to wear spurs for it. And I kicked my foot in the air and the spur fell off with all of the parents watching.
Props hate people. Props hate people. I tell that to actors all the time. Props hate people.
But really, I think I date it from the house system in my school in England. It was divided into 4 houses. And there was a speech competition. And so everybody in what we called, first form, 6th grade basically, had to be screened by the housemaster to see who might be a good candidate for standing on stage. 1,000 students out there, and little 11th grader me, 11-year-old, me, I was chosen. I didn't think I had any particular skill. And he said, you're doing it. So obviously I had something.
You were
I
conscribed.
was conscribed.
Yeah.
And I remember it was a poem called The Lighthouse. And can you just imagine an 11-year-old in front of 1,000 people and faculty standing there, no experience doing that. And I go up in the middle of it and I recover, except to do a very English thing, which is to use the word me instead of my. So one of the lines from the poem was, I stand here in my place. And I said, because I was so scared, I stand here in me place. And that's why I didn't win that particular year, because I made that mistake. Anyway, fast forward. In England, in those days, I can't speak for now, you don't really audition for plays. You said, you're playing this role. That's it. We'll work things out. And so the first
That's the company system.
In a way, that's right.
Yeah, that's a company system.
You are
right?
absolutely right.
This is the talent we have. You're best for this part. You're best for this part. You're best for this part. Let's get to work.
There's a lot to be said for that.
Yes.
It was, I was in Devil's Disciple by George Bernard Shaw.
Sure.
The first one. And then I played again at high school, Bassanio and Hotspur as well.
Wow.
And those were my experiences there. Then an interim period where I went to South America. I taught down there for nearly 4 years. Came up to California to graduate school, and I had some time on my hands. And I was looking at one of those kiosks where they post things about this stuff you can do and so on and so forth. And I was torn between two things. One, they were looking for a DJ in the radio station, and the other was an audition for this fledgling company called TheatreWorks in Palo Alto. It wasn't quite fledgling at that point. And I got the role of Macduff in that. And we played it. And Stephen, this one I'm sure will resonate with you. We played it in the Nature Interpretive Center right on the edge of the bay, which seats a maximum of 80 people.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got this dramatic fight scene at the end, of course, with broadswords and all that. Well, you can't do that when the audience is sitting 6 inches away from you.
I have.
Have you really?
Yes.
My brave man.
Yeah, well, when I had my little black box theater in Burbank, which was a 50-seat house, the front row of the audience is literally inches away from the actors.
Mm-hmm.
And, we did shows. We did Macbeth. We did Romeo and Juliet. Oh. So you have rapiers flashing around, and the audience. You could see the audience like sit deep back in their chairs and tuck in their legs and arms while they watch these sword fights going on with, obviously we would choreograph things so that everything played upstage as much as possible with as far as like thrusts and parries and that kind of thing. But yeah,
you've been there.
We've done it real close, like real close. Yeah.
Well, Robert Kelly, who directed this, the artistic director of TheatreWorks, he's retiring soon, I think this year. He made the decision to use staves or staves instead. And so we fought with those, and I stabbed.
How do you cut off Macbeth's head with a staff?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. We overlooked that.
Oh, okay. That's kind of that's a little textual problem.
Yeah, I don't think we actually showed his head. There was some cutting that went on in that show. But anyway, that and let's see, verges in Much Ado About Nothing here, a tiny role. I'm trying to think of some other ones that I've done here. Not a great deal, I have to say. I mean, I 5, 6, 7 Shakespeare shows.
Now, how many Shakespeare roles have you played post Stratfordian?
None.
So since becoming an Oxfordian, you haven't had the ability to get on stage with one of those characters and sort of look at it from that different perspective.
And I'd love to do that.
Right? I mean,
for
me, it has been such a life changer.
Really?
With regards to my artistic appreciation and understanding. And it's one of the reasons why, I constantly say, what do you mean it doesn't matter? It matters in so many ways, especially because it's not just literature, it is art. And it requires this internal knowledge of what the author's true intent was or what his true motivation was as much as possible. And oftentimes, recently there was an article, the current artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company was on record as saying it doesn't matter, which I feel is sort of like a cop-out that a lot of artists take as a way to just avoid the issue altogether, right? And especially because if you turn to those same actors, those same theater directors, and you ask them, oh, would you do a Tennessee Williams play without reading about Tennessee Williams' life? How about Ibsen? How about Chekhov? Like, let's just run the gamut. Let's go down the list. How much table work do you do in your rehearsal processes, and how much of that table work involves the life of the author? I'll bet in every one of those instances, a ton.
Right.
But this guy, the greatest of all time, is the one that doesn't matter to you, because I don't buy that. I think that that's a bunch of hogwash.
And the other side of the coin there, of course, is there is a danger of hijacking the production at that point. You've got 6 weeks of rehearsal, and you really want to look at it from this particular point of view, and you're dealing with people who perhaps don't know that there is a controversy to begin with. So I know that I would, I think, just be a little bit careful, just speaking for myself, to say, look, this isn't about me, but there is a big issue we should talk about. I'm not sure how I could handle it.
I do it, I kind of do it subversively. I do it the way that I think that he did it, right? So when you look at the plays, there are so many messages in every play, right? And some of the most important messages of the play are the most veiled messages. Like for instance, with let's use Merchant of Venice as an example, right? So there's this huge message about religious tolerance in the play, from my perspective, but I believe it's laced beneath this comic satire in such a way that it's designed that the audience, halfway home, suddenly the light bulb goes off after seeing a performance of it and go, oh my God, that's what that meant. Or, oh, that's what the message was, because that's the way he did most of what he did, right? He snuck it in.
He had to.
And so I kind of follow that model when I'm directing a Shakespeare play. I do the same thing. I sort of sneak it in. I just start saying, well, the author intended this, and the author had this happen in his life. And then eventually some actor will come to me and go, I don't remember reading about any of that before, about Stratford. And I was like, well, here, read this book.
Yeah, but you're talking as a director. My comment was about as being an actor.
Okay.
A different power structure there.
Sure.
Yeah. I just remembered too, randomly, I played Falstaff in Merry Wives of Windsor as well, which I believe, isn't that the only play that essentially probably was set in Elizabethan times?
It is the only play that was set in Elizabethan times in a modern to him location.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
So when you see all of these productions done with Elizabethan roughs and all the rest of it, I mean, that's just...
Well, that's something that is very interesting about many of the texts, is that, you have characters who talk about their clothing. For instance, there's a scene in Julius Caesar, right, where Casca and Cassius come upon each other, and they're talking about the constellations and the whirling of the stars and all of these omens that are presaging what is to come the next day in the capital. And Casca says, what are you doing, Cassius, in a night such as this with your doublet all unbraced?
Right.
That's, wait a minute, what doublet? It's in ancient Rome. What the heck are you talking about? But so we forget that a lot of times these actors in that day and age were actually dressed in the clothing of their day, with just suggestions, just hints of whatever the time period might be. So you might have, the Roman Senate are all wearing doublets and hose, and then they have like a sash or a laurel wreath for Caesar. They're not actually dressed to the period of the play being written.
Which brings up a question: did the king's men or the chamberlain's men have a costume department? I don't know the answer.
There are plenty of records, in fact, of particular items being purchased by theater companies, and or bolts of fabric. Some of those theaters kept very detailed line items about things that they purchased to use for stage productions. And so we do have some of that. And we do see that, No, they're not saying 4 togas purchased for a production of Julius Caesar. We don't ever see that.
Yeah.
It's more like, these doublets, these pantaloons,
Right.
that kind of thing. So it's interesting that in today's day and age, if you're what is called a traditionalist or a classicist with Shakespeare, you're costuming shows and setting shows in the time period that they are written to be in the setting they are written to be in, but remembering that that's not how they were produced. So like if you're a true traditionalist, it would have to be an all-male cast wearing Elizabethan garb.
There we go.
For every production.
And it's also important, I think, to point out that we do not know when any of the plays were actually written. We know when they were produced, published. But
I'd like to
written.
see, and I'm going to throw this out to the powers that be as a proposal for a future debate for a Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship conference. Is I think it'd be an intriguing debate that wouldn't ruffle too many feathers. Is to talk about that. Like, let's debate the dating of the plays. Let's take Kevin Gilvari's excellent book and talk about that timeline. Let's talk about a timeline. I'd be willing to be the participant to talk about the artistic development as a writer and how that informs the dating of the plays, as far as which plays are the earlier, less dramatically developed plays and which ones are the more dramatically developed plays, and which ones I believe were corrected for posterity beyond the concept of drama for the stage. Because I believe that there are places, like I believe the Hamlet we have was never meant to be performed. That 4-hour version, I believe that that's not the performance script.
I think Antony and Cleopatra was certainly not meant to be performed.
That's another great one to consider. So, I would love to see us have that kind of conversation, because I think it would help us to more clearly define that timeline, to then fit that timeline to the correct writer.
And isn't it true that people say, well, look, audiences were able to watch 4-hour productions because Hamlet would have been 4 hours long, but only if it was produced as a 4-hour long play. And that's basically what you're saying.
Yeah, and I don't believe that was ever the case in that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially because the version we have, it appears, came near the very end of Oxford's life. And I believe, like I said, I believe he was putting that down for posterity as a work of literature, not as a performance script.
Yeah.
And I think you can see that through some of the plays, very particularly. Macbeth is definitely a performance script. And it's one of the finest. And it's short, and it's fast, and it's furious, and it's done. And it's one of the reasons why it's the most popular of all of the plays and one of the most popularly produced, right? It has all the elements it needs. It's a masterful work. We had there's a great episode of this series on that topic and on how Macbeth connects to the ancient Greeks. Also, Earl Showerman in that episode. So if you haven't listened to that one, go back and listen to that one.
Yeah.
I going along those lines. So I've produced Macbeth multiple times. I've directed it multiple times. Once on a big, giant, grand scale on a 140-foot wide proscenium in an outdoor amphitheater seating 3,800 people, and we made the choice with that production to be traditional, quote unquote, in that all of our Scotsmen were wearing their kilts and all had their tartans, which is absolutely inaccurate.
Right.
Right, because the play is set in 1000. The real Macbeth lived from 1000 to 1054 was the time period of his life, which tells you that when you cast that role, it should be an actor who's in their early 50s, which is hardly ever done.
Right.
But that's the way it should be, right? And it's the medieval period. Tartans and kilts don't show up for like another 400 years, not until like the 15th century. So but it made people more comfortable, helped them to accept the world. It's what the audience expects, right? Is Scotland, kilts. They don't know that history, that timeline. So sometimes you do things.
You fudge it.
Yeah, you do things for the entertainment value.
Right,
And
absolutely.
I think he understood that as well And that's why we have certain aspects of the plays where scholars will go, well, this doesn't make any sense. And that proves that it was William of Stratford because he didn't really know.
Right.
And I disagree. I say, well, no, I think what it proves is that you have a masterful theater artist who understands what the audience needs to follow the story.
And along those lines, you and I both saw a production of the Scottish play this summer, and I think we were both driven crazy by the fact that it did not take advantage. And I think every show should do this. You start with a bang. You grab the audience at the very beginning. I think you have about 2 to 3 minutes to get the audience in at the top of a show. And if you waste that time, you're forever trying to pull them back in. So
that's very true. And, you know, they've done studies too. And I'm a big proponent of this, especially when you're doing like a large scale musical production or something of that sort. So if you look at a Shakespearean play, the scene changes are almost seamless in most cases. If you're doing Antony and Cleopatra, it has 12 different locations. That's nearly impossible to create for an audience. And it's really difficult to follow that play because of that.
Well, I saw one production where they had gobos and they projected the name of the country on the stage.
I think that's a smart way of dealing with that problem because you're bouncing all over the Mediterranean in that play, right? So I think when you're looking at trying to create a place, an atmosphere, a location for your audience, you have to look at the different aspects of whether that's important to the story or not, and whether or not the audience can follow that or not. And I forget where my train of thought was going now.
Well, I can jump in with an example if you like.
Please.
Which is, I'd forgotten that I also played Christopher Sly in Taming of the Shrew in the induction.
Oh, yes.
Which is often not done.
I never do it.
And for audience members who do not know this, essentially, Taming of the Shrew is a play within a play. So Christopher Sly is a drunk and he falls asleep, and the Duke and his men come across him and say, let's put on a show for this guy and make him believe he's a duke. Well, in this production, which was in Saratoga at the Pulmasson Winery, as it was at the time, 1,100 seat, I played Christopher Sly, and the director had me act drunk in the audience, go up on stage and start ripping the set apart when all the cast members would come out and try and stop me, and then fall asleep and the play would start. It was clever. It's very clever.
I like that.
And one day I'm up there doing this, and all of a sudden an audience member jumps up, grabs me from behind, and starts wrestling me on stage.
Oh, no.
And then he stops all of a sudden and says, oh, expletive, is this part of the show? And he lets me go. And he turns around and he has to face 1,100 people who may have thought that he was also part of the show. I don't know, but he didn't. And he was so apologetic. He tracked down the cast party that evening and came along and personally apologized to every person. But my goodness,
that's a great story.
Isn't it a great story? Because he was part of the world.
Oh, wow. He was in it. He was in it.
Yeah.
So, connecting back to what I was going to say is, so, you know, in Shakespeare plays, your scene changes are seamless. And when I direct a Shakespeare play, I try to make it that, you know, these people leave the stage as these people come on the stage, and the action stays as continuously flowing as possible. There's nothing worse than a play that bogs down with these long scene changes. And they've proven that 20 seconds is the limit.
Really?
Yes. After 20 seconds of a scene change, the audience starts losing the attention, losing the ability to follow the story anymore. And for every second beyond 20 seconds, it requires a minute of stage time to bring them back to the story. So if your scene change is 25 seconds, you've just cost yourself 5 minutes of attention span that you've got to now pull back in. And they've done psychological studies on this where they have timed things. And so when I'm producing a play that does require scene changes, I'm a stickler on my crew about you got 20 seconds. And if we can't get this done in 20 seconds, we're destroying everything we've done up to this point in telling this story.
And it also, those scene changes, as you're talking about, also argue against something that always strikes me with Shakespeare's characters. They don't stop and think they know exactly what they're going to say. Now, of course, the famous soliloquy in Hamlet, of course he's thinking, but he is thinking in fully formed thoughts. And so the dialogue is so compact and just takes you forwards. You, as you say, you cannot let scene changes disrupt that.
No, and it's one of the reasons why most of the plays don't have that kind of thing. And so it can be frustrating to me when I go see a production and they have made this choice that the set is so important or that they've got to go through this, giant scene change to show us that we've gone to a different place. Well, let the actors take us to that place. Not that scenery and sets aren't important, but if they overshadow the story, if they become the story, then I think we've lost sight of what the story is supposed to be.
And with costumes too, and again, what was the show? I can't remember now, but the character had to wear this wonderful white dress with a long train, which maybe cost $4,000 or $5,000 just for that one costume. And when she came on stage and walked across the stage, it was absolutely stunning. I will never forget that, but I do forget the rest of the show.
Well, there you go. It's kind of like a Super Bowl halftime show.
There you go.
It's all about the clothes.
Right.
Doesn't matter what they sang, what they did. It's all about what they exposed, how much they were showing. It's all about the clothes.
And of course, you as a director then have to handle all the personalities behind the costume designer, set designer, scene designer, and so on.
Yes. And one of the things I will say, bringing up the NFL halftime show, one of the most marvelous moment that for me was the costume changes and how fast they happened. Because, as a performer and as a producer director, you understand. And, here's another thing that's true about our writer. He understood this too. And so here's something that I have fallen into, and I'm sure there are other producers and directors out there who have faced this same situation where you've got a script and it's a 3-hour long play and you've got to make cuts. Whether it's because that's the rule of the house, or it's because you want to keep the story flowing, or it's because there are some scenes that are just, extraneous and do not quite fit with what you're trying to tell, or for length, for whatever it is. But nearly every Shakespearean production is cut somehow, some way. Very few are produced word for word, beginning to end. And you can run into the weeds by going, oh, this scene isn't necessary. Who cares what's going on in this scene? But then you realize that he put that scene there because of a costume change.
Right, exactly.
Because he understood. Because remember, it's a cast of 40 characters. It's not a cast of 40 actors. And many of these actors are playing multiple roles. Well, they have to change clothes. He knew that. He's like, oh, this guy's going to die here. He's going to come back. He's the Duke of whatever. He's going to die here. He's going to come back as the Earl of this over here.
Right.
I'm going to put this scene in between to give him time to change his costume. So then, this producer director comes along and goes, oh, that scene's not necessary. Then you're in rehearsals and the actor's going, how the hell do you expect me to change costume? And you're like, oops, put that scene back.
That's the mechanics of it.
Suddenly you're inserting scenes back into the play because you're like, damn, he knew. He was so smart. He knew what he was doing.
Right.
Because he was a true theater artist. And I would argue that he directed many of these early court performances of these plays as well. I in my mind, I don't have any proof of that. We have no proof of Edward de Vere as director in that sense. But in my mind, he was producer, director, writer, and most likely even performer in many of the earliest performances of some of these texts, which we know for a fact on many of them were court performances long before they showed up at the Rose or the Globe or anywhere else that the public got to see them.
And just going back to your true statement about you have to get rid of something. I forget who the famous actor was, but he was playing Hamlet and went to Laurence Olivier and said, the to be or not to be speech. How do I play that? And Olivier says, cut it.
Well, Olivier goes down in history as having a lot of those great one-liner answers to actors who have asked him, what he should do or how he should do or whatever. I love stories like that.
Me too. And the other famous one, probably famous, I don't know, he goes up, and he's on stage wandering around, and everybody is assembled, the other actors upstage, and he wanders up to them and says, "Anybody know my next line?" And one actor says, "Yes, I do." "Well, what is it?" "Sorry, sir, I don't act that way." He never worked again, left Olivier.
I don't act that way.
Yeah, right.
What is my next line?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's interesting because those types of stories always lend themselves to this great debate. And that is, and you tell me what you think as an actor, because I ask this question of all actors all the time. What is worse when you're on stage? Going up or looking at your fellow actor knowing that they have gone up?
Going up.
It's worse to be the one who has gone up.
Absolutely.
Than to be facing a fellow actor who is up and you can't help them, or you're trying to figure out how to help them.
And that's bad too.
Yes.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Either one is, but I have a very clever technique too, which is when I go up, I stare at somebody as if it's them who's gone up.
Oh,
isn't that bad? Isn't that terrible? That's awful.
Transference.
I know. And I don't do it deliberately, but all of us.
Do you whip your head and look at them too? Like
they come off stage saying, "What did I do wrong?" And it was me. I don't do it deliberately. It's just the way that I cover. But honestly, when you go up I played Atticus Finch once, and I could not, in the courtroom scene, I could not remember.
Oh, that's a bucket list role for me.
Oh, it is fabulous role.
I want to play that part really bad.
Oh, absolutely. So I'm wandering around the stage, totally lost, and it was probably, 10 seconds, which means 10 hours in your head. And there's the stage manager going through the script off stage. And then she grabs herself around the throat like that to remind me it was the bit about the well where somebody was attacked. And I'm back on again at that point. I will forever thank her.
Well, those kinds of behind the scenes stories are very intriguing. Obviously for those of us who are theater artists, we all have those fun stories to tell, but people who haven't tread the boards, who aren't the thespian types, they tend to love to hear those stories, I think,
yes.
more than anything.
Yes.
Well, there was this one time.
Yeah, right. And it's interesting that superstition comes into this as well. And I'm fond of saying I'm not superstitious, I'm sort of normalstitious. But on this day when I went up as Atticus Finch, I had walked to the theatre instead of driving to the theatre. Now, I'm trained scientifically.
You broke your routine.
I'm trained scientifically. It shouldn't make any difference. But I never walked to the theatre again, and I never went up again. Obvious proof, right?
Okay, so what if I counter that and say, well, you're saying as a scientist it shouldn't have made any difference, but if I counter that and say, yeah, but isn't science about having a controlled environment, and you changed the circumstances of that controlled environment, and so the result is going to be different?
Absolutely, and it's a good case too, but there are other small changes that naturally happen, but that one was obviously large enough to make a huge difference. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Right.
Well, a routine is very important in the theater. I tell that to actors all the time, and when we get into Tech Week particularly, I say, start developing your routine. That doesn't mean that every performance should be routine, because it's live theater, and you wouldn't want that. You wouldn't want a static routine performance, but you do need to have a routine once. That routine of I arrive at the theater at this time, I check my props, I get my costumes ready, I get into makeup, I get dressed, I do my warm-ups, whatever that is. You have to have your routine. And then that routine continues once the curtain rises.
Right.
I exit here, I go and I sit here in this place while I wait for my next entrance. I go and I sit over here while I wait for that entrance. So-and-so comes and sits there. And some of the times what that routine can help is I'm sitting backstage waiting for my next entrance, and usually right about this time is when John walks by to go make his entrance.
Yeah.
Today, John didn't walk by. Somebody find John before he misses his entrance, and it can save a big tragedy if there's a routine, because people go, wait a minute, something's wrong with the routine. Yeah. What's wrong with the routine? How do we fix this? Yeah. And, there's John off in the corner having a chat with someone else and about to miss their entrance. But because he didn't walk by when I'm used to him walking by, I was able to catch it and save it,
Yep. I've gone up a few times, and I can remember each one in awful, painful detail. Never missed an entrance. But here's a question for you. I have acted with many actors who on opening night are so good. and they repeat that same performance, that same performance every show. They are the same every time, and they are good. I can never do that. I start out and I hope I go upwards. I hope I don't go down. But on closing night, I am not the same as I am on opening night. It's just me. Have you noticed that? Do you have a feeling about it?
I do. And I think that, I believe that consistency is the actor's best friend. And I believe it's not just your own consistency, but the consistency of your fellow actors.
Oh, yes.
Which is why we're very strong against, don't mess with it.
Right.
Don't try something new. Oh, it's
right.
Closing night. I want to do something different
sure,
on the last
sure.
show. You could throw off the whole thing. Once the show has opened, the workshop is closed.
But except, yes, and I agree 99%. I'm discovering new things.
That's inevitable, especially in a truncated rehearsal process where you've got to throw it all together in 6 weeks, but it's a 3-week run, which is 3 more weeks of having this material and exploring. And I'm not saying don't continue to evolve the performance, but if you make major changes, you're asking for trouble, right? Mm-hmm. Unless everyone's on board or it's discovered. That's why most processes include a preview phase of performances. That's where you kind of finding out, oh, wait, that's not working. We need to fix it here. We need to change that there.
Right.
Those kinds of things. So, but I think that truthfully, having that consistency is not only important to you as an actor, but to your fellow actors. And I think that it comes in through muscle memory even too. For me, one of the ways that I remember my lines is I tie actions to the words.
Absolutely.
And, so every night it's, 3 steps this way, turn, deliver this line. Mm-hmm. If you don't do those 3 steps and turn, is that line going to come? Is it going to be there? Maybe not. Right. So stay consistent, keep that blocking tied to the dialogue to remain consistent is important. And in roles where I've had to have extreme emotion, deep sadness or actual tears involved. Once you find that moment where it happens for you, wherever it does in the rehearsal process, after that, it's like instant. It's clockwork. It'll be the same word, the same moment, night after night, and that's when the tears will come because the body knows, the body remembers. And it's why as a director and an actor, I'm a big proponent of sensory input, right? Everything we do is based on the data we receive. And we can sort of trick the body by creating the data, right? So, sometimes I'll say, memory replacement is a big technique for me. And I'll say to an actor, if it's your grandfather's cherry tobacco that makes you remember him the most, and then every time you smell that cherry tobacco, you well up, you tear up because you miss him. And you need to play on the stage a character who is missing someone through loss of that nature. Well, then you need to have a pouch of that cherry tobacco to use in your process. Once you have substituted the memory, the emotion, you don't need the cherry tobacco anymore because now the circumstances under which you are tearful are happening around you every night. It's the same set, it's the same costume, it's the same actor standing in front of you saying the same lines, and it should just trigger the exact same emotion night after night after night, the way that cherry tobacco will always trigger that emotion in you.
And it's interesting how audience members sometimes say, my goodness, it was so impressive that you cried. How did you do that? Well, it's part of your craft, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. Music is a huge one.
Oh,
right?
gosh, yes.
And I know many actors who create a tape or a recording that they'll listen to while they're getting ready, while they're putting their makeup on, a certain theme to the music or choose a song that does evoke a certain emotion in them. So, all of those, everything you can. I've worked very closely with a dear friend of mine who is a perfumer. He's a scent expert, and he has created a series now through our collaborative efforts called thespian. And he creates scents based on the text of the play and our collaboration, our input together on what some of those smells should be. And then he will bring them to a rehearsal with me and my actors. and he'll pass around samples of those smells, and we'll talk about what the smells evoke in us and how they connect to the play. And then each actor gets to choose a scent as theirs, which he'll infuse on a little piece of leather in a glass vial for them, and that they will then be able to use as part of their process to help them find the character, find the emotion. He's done it for other plays besides Shakespeare. For Greek tragedy, he did our production of Oedipus Antigone, in which I played Oedipus, and I chose Laurel. And right before having to come on in that scene with Jocasta dead, I would take a nice whiff of that Laurel, and it would take me right to where I needed to be for the emotional moments of that scene right before gouging my eyes out. Yeah, so
I've never heard of that before.
It's a fabulous technique. All of the actors that I have introduced it to that we've worked with that have really put it to fine use. Some of them will just open it up and have it at their dressing table while they're preparing, while they're putting on their makeup and getting ready. Some of them leave it strategically in places backstage. We'd find little vials backstage all over backstage after a performance where an actor forgot where they had put it, or whatever, because they leave it strategically and come off stage, use it, go out there and play the role. So different actors have used it in different ways. That's a big part of the craft, is that we all have our own process.
Right.
But yeah, smells are olfactory is huge.
I had a friend, Molly, who would sit down in front of the mirror, and she'd look intently at it and say, "Okay, Molly, dare to be ugly," before putting her makeup on.
Nice. Very good. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming in and joining us today for this episode. It's been a fascinating conversation. I always love to hear about the different backgrounds of Oxfordians, how they came to it, and how their personal story has reflected on their areas of research. It sounds like we will be able to expect from you in the very near future a very well prepared and thought out paper that exemplifies the laws of physics and how our author knew them and incorporated them into certain aspects of certain plays. The nutshell and infinite space in Hamlet is one I'll throw at you.
Right.
You might want to begin there and work backwards. I don't know.
No pressure.
None whatsoever. The next conference is end of September, beginning of October in Ashland, Oregon, which is right in your backyard. So you've got a few months to get it together and get ready. I think you can probably make that happen.
I needed something to do.
Yeah. So we want to remind all of our fellow quillers out there that the Don't Quill the Messenger podcast series is sponsored by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. If you'd like to learn more about the Shakespeare authorship question and the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, please visit shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. That's shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. If you'd like to hear more podcasts, go to your favorite streaming location. And if you are on one of those that allows you to rate and review our series, we would ask you to please do that. Give us a high rating, especially if you believe in this mission and you want to help us achieve this mission. The higher you rate and review our shows, the more they are out there for people to see and find and perhaps discover this for the first time and do a little learning and maybe a little reading and be a little bit entertained. Thank you again for inviting us into your car, your home, your shower, wherever it is that you listen to our podcast series. We're pleased to join you and forever grateful that you have been downloading us and streaming us and chiming in. You can get your Don't Quill the Messenger swag on at dragonwagonradio.com is your place for all of your Quiller swag, and we hope you will wear it proudly. I have a few t-shirts, coffee mug, and a few items of my own, so please go there, and it does help support the show. We appreciate you for that as well. And as I always say, don't forget, Quillers, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com. don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.